Americans living in urban areas are repeatedly given the idea that rural citizens and resource users are callous towards endangered species because they don't care as much for endangered species as they do about making a profit. The opposite is true, however. Rural citizens have lived with these species, often for generations. Although rural resource users want to maintain viable populations of these species, they know it can be done while also allowing them to use their land to the fullest extent possible. Today, the Endangered Species Act severely limits land use, often in an arbitrary manner. It offers environmental NGOs a powerful weapon against landowners without any real increase in the protection of endangered species. The ESA, or Endangered Species Act of 1973, is authorized on the basis of 5 international treaties ratified by the United States and not on any specific authority given Congress in Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution. Those 5 include the Migratory Bird Treaties with Canada and Mexico, the Migratory and Endangered Bird Treaty with Japan, Convention on Nature Protection and Wildlife Preservation in the Western Hemisphere, the International Convention for the Northwest Atlantic Fisheries, the International Convention for the High Seas Fisheries of the North Pacific Ocean, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. Unfortunately, the designation of an endangered species like the bald eagle can profoundly limit land use in the majority of counties in the United States. While listing a species or designation of critical habitat does not set up a preserve, refuge, or specific regulation, landowners with habitat for a listed species on their property must avoid any use that might harm or kill that protected species or destroy its habitat. These restrictions are often severely interpreted by government regulators and federal judges. Some endangered species cover huge areas that impact millions of rural residents, and even sometimes urban citizens. While only those acres having appropriate habitat within a county are impacted, the impact can be unnecessarily large to those property owners or resource users that are affected. For example, the federal court ruled in 2001 that 2 endangered suckerfish, the short-nosed and the Lost River suckers, were essentially entitled to all the water in Klamath Lake, Oregon. The deed to that water was originally granted to the Klamath farmers by the federal government in the early 1900s. Life magazine even did a feature story on the Klamath Basin in 1947. Even though the farmers owned the water on which their livelihoods depended, they could no longer use it. The Klamath Basin was a rich farming area. Without water, however, farmers couldn't plant. Their fields lie idle, turning into dust bowls. Property value dropped from as much as $2,500 an acre to less than $50 an acre overnight. Farmers lost their livelihood and their investment when, by a stroke of a pen, their property rights were eliminated. A farmer with 500 acres lost up to $1.2 million of equity in his land. That equity represents their life savings. It is the same as if the federal government took a person's life savings out of their bank to pay for protecting the endangered suckerfish. In total, nearly $500 million was lost over the entire basin. That's not all. Thousands of Klamath residents lost their jobs. Businesses that supported farming also faced financial ruin. Huge protests were held, to no avail. Later that summer, the National Academy of Sciences reviewed the science supporting the court decision and found the science to have been grossly distorted. The Academy said that they found, quote, no clear evidence, unquote, that high lake levels benefited the suckers, nor was there, quote, convincing scientific justification, unquote, for not allowing the farmers to continue to use the water for irrigation. In fact, the evidence showed that the sucker fish seemed to do better when the farmers used the lake water for irrigation. In summary, an arbitrary ESA decision, authorized by international treaties and based on questionable science, brought economic devastation to thousands of Americans. No one denies that some species are at risk. However, the Endangered Species Act is written so loosely that even if a species is common elsewhere, or its occurrence is naturally very low, or it has a very slight genetic difference, it can be listed as endangered. Environmental NGOs put enormous political pressure on and lawsuits against the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and other federal agencies to list any species, regardless of whether it is truly endangered. Over 1,200 species have been listed as threatened or endangered, and many counties contain 5, 10, 40, or even more species, each occupying a different habitat. This example represents counties impacted by less than 80 of the total 1,200 species that are listed. Arbitrary regulations imposed on property owners in counties having multiple overlapping endangered species can severely impact land use over most of the county. Environmental NGOs then use the endangered species in lawsuits that are usually upheld by activist judges. It is so bad that former Assistant Attorney General Tom Sansetti said that the ESA, quote, is pretty much inoperable. It is run by the third branch of government. It is the judges that are running the ESA right now. It is out of control, and Congress needs to revisit it and amend it, unquote. The wanton abuse of the ESA by NGOs is imposing land use restrictions, denying landowners the ability to use their land economically, even when using proven management practices. The lives of tens of thousands of people are being destroyed by the ESA. It gets worse. There is a growing consensus that the ESA does not work. Former Congressman Richard Pombo, Republican of California and chairman of the House Resources Committee, says that after 30 years, the Endangered Species Act has given us very little to be proud of. Since its inception, nearly 1,300 species have been listed as threatened or endangered, and yet not one single species has been recovered as a result of the ESA alone. The bottom line, the ESA has a 0% rate of success. Why has the ESA been such a failure? Environmentalists have long said that man's use of ecosystems destroys the habitat needed by these species. But that is only partially true. Different species of plants and animals are naturally found in different habitats. If those habitats are changed, the species using them will often decline in number. One of the problems with the ESA is that it attempts to protect those habitats, which is impossible because they are constantly changing, even if man never disturbs them. The reason for this is that there exists in nature something called natural succession. If, for instance, a mature forest burns, is attacked by insects, blows down, or is harvested, it first grows back as a grassland with forbs or shrubs. Eventually, fast-growing early successional trees reinvade, followed by slower-growing trees that will make up a mature forest, and finally, very shade-tolerant trees that comprise the final stage of succession, called a climax forest. The first problem with the ESA, then, is that no law can save habitat. Habitat is not static. It's going to change, with or without the ESA. The principle is true even for development, such as subdivisions, as planted shrubs and ornamental trees mature. The second problem with the ESA, perpetuated by environmental NGOs, the media, and the courts, is the belief that a decline in the abundance of species threatens the species. Let's take a look at a dramatic example in Maine. Maine suffered a devastating epidemic of spruce budworm during the 1980s, causing the death of spruce and fir over hundreds of thousands of acres of industrial forest land. All the red trees in this photo are dead spruce and fir. The paper companies launched a huge program to salvage as much of this dead and dying timber as possible, clear-cutting vast areas of forests. The resulting moonscape looked like ecological devastation. But was it? To find out, a major ecosystem level study was conducted by the Manomet Bird Observatory in the early 1990s. The study determined that bird species were plentiful, immediately following what appeared to be an ecologically devastating clear-cut. It increased slightly after a few years of growth. Interestingly, there were even fewer bird species if part of the original forest remained. Comparatively, there were even fewer species in deciduous hardwood or coniferous softwood forests of intermediate age, and even fewer species when the hardwoods and softwoods coexisted. A similar relationship existed for a mature forest, except that more bird species were found in the conifer forests. The striking finding, however, is that although each age class supported a different set of species, there are far more species found in the seemingly devastated clear-cutting areas than in the older stands, exactly the opposite of what most people believe.